evening, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of Great Decisions 2024. I'm joined tonight by Professor Elise Coen, who I will be turning over the program to in just a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to remind everyone, please have questions and comments ready to go. Just type them into the comments box on either YouTube or Facebook, whichever you're watching on this evening. And we probably won't get to them till the end of the lecture when it just becomes a complete Q&A. But please get your questions and comments in early. Before we get rolling with Professor Coen, I just want to do a little bit of library self-promotion, and it'll seem like extreme self-promotion, but we have a really fun another virtual program coming up this Thursday, which is called MPL Insider Beyond the Books with Tim and Emily. And yes, I am the Tim with my little pig on my shoulder there. I don't mean Emily, I mean the porcelain pig that's on my shoulder. This week, Betty Schweedy is our guest. She's going to be talking about a great early literacy program that we have coming up. And we also have a couple special guests that are going to be on the show. It is definitely worth tuning in. Grab a sandwich, grab whatever your beverage of choice is for lunch, and join us at noon on Thursday for this program that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at Manitowoc Public Library. And now that that is out of the way, we will get to the meat of the program for the evening. I will introduce Professor Coen, and then just immediately she will go right into her lecture. She wanted me to keep her in as small a box as possible, but for her intro, I'm going to open it up to the larger portrait. So, Elise Coen is currently Associate Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Public and Environmental Affairs Unit at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. Her research focuses on global governance, refugees, human rights, and U.S. foreign policy. Her articles have appeared in journals such as International Affairs, International Relations, Ethics and International Affairs, Politics and Religion, and the International Journal of Human Rights. Her book, Reconfiguring Refugees, is forthcoming from New York University Press this summer in August of 2024. So, without further ado, let me take myself out of the picture and bring Professor Coen's PowerPoint in. And I'm gone, and Professor Coen, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. It's always such an honor to be invited back to present for this series, and I want to just take a moment to recognize and thank Kathy Fishbeck and all those working behind the scenes to organize these lectures, the League of Women Voters, the Manitowoc Public Library, and of course, Tim. It's so impressive how year after year, their hard work and determination to help educate the public never tires. And I just want to say that I really admire the effort that they put into this Great Decision series. So I really appreciate the organizers also for allowing 2 lectures on the Middle East realignment topic this year. My approach will hopefully give you all something a little bit unique this evening, because I am including an angle on understanding the region that I refer to as intercultural communication. So if you notice in my title slide here, I have Middle East realignment and intercultural communication. So the purpose of this approach is to try to move beyond the typical US-centric perspective and to consider some things that might be missing when we neglect the complex and diverse cultural context in the region. And I say this acknowledging that I am a US-based scholar, and I am trained to study and analyze international affairs from a largely US-centric and Eurocentric perspective in my discipline. If we go to the next slide, I will show you some images here of the time I spent in Egypt when I was a graduate student, because fortunately, I believe I also have some background that helps inspire me to try and press against those conventional boundaries in US foreign policy and to try and think outside that box. I focused on intercultural communication and the Middle East when I was an undergraduate student, and in graduate school had the chance to gain an appreciation for learning other languages, immersing in different cultural and religious contexts, and working on a dissertation project that aimed at trying to understand perspectives which ran counter to the mainstream policy narrative at the time. These are some of the photographs in this slide that you're seeing, which I took when I was traveling and researching in Egypt, including the really diverse contexts of the country. Like you see that heavily urban landscape of Cairo, the beautiful Mediterranean views of the coastal city of Alexandria, and the relatively quiet, by comparison, Nile River heading south down towards the border with Sudan in the city of Aswan. And at that time, when I was there in the late 2000s, the mainstream policy narratives in the United States were that the Middle East was just a fundamentally anti-American region because there were irreconcilable differences between Muslim and Arab values on the one hand, and then American values on the other hand. When during my doctoral fieldwork in Egypt, I learned just how flawed that mainstream narrative premise was, that these issues were not really about differences in irreconcilable values, but in the perceived destructive and harmful effects of US foreign policy in the region. And rather than irreconcilable cultural differences, I came to learn that there were numerous possibilities of bridging perspectives and building dialogues, but it required acknowledging past harm that was done and grappling with the way that US foreign policy was being felt and received on the other end by people directly impacted in their day-to-day lives. So that's just a little bit to start out. I wanted to give you a sense of my own journey to valuing intercultural communication as an approach to understanding the region. So we can go to the next slide. And one thing I wanted to just remind people that are tuning in tonight is at the end, we're going to do Q&A. So if things pop up while I'm speaking and you want to bring it back later, then once I finish, we will have questions and comments and discussion like that. So here in this slide, I wanted to give you a little bit of background before I jump into the intercultural communication lens. Just to first orient ourselves to the traditional US-centric lens of understanding the Middle East. So it's often summarized that oil, terrorism, and containing some iteration of Islamist movements, or what gets called Islamic extremism, are the three guiding principles shaping US foreign policy towards the Middle East. And then, of course, we could add the US alliance with Israel as a fourth main interest, but I'll be talking a little bit about that one separately in a moment. This lens, what you see listed in this slide here, has really enabled justifications of the US doing several things: maintaining relationships and even providing direct aid and support to a number of autocratic regimes, like the Saudi royal family, for example, to secure its interests regarding access to oil and gas. This traditional lens has also made sense of providing exports of weapons to autocratic regimes like Egypt, despite the human rights violations of those regimes, as part of a partnership in, quote, counterterrorism. And often those autocratic regimes will use that counterterrorism strategy not just to crack down on actual armed groups, but also just to crack down on their own domestic political opposition groups, which are unarmed. And Egypt gets around 1/3 of its weapons from the United States government. That's something well known among the Egyptian public, particularly people who have risked their own lives for trying to enact social and political change in their country. They know that the United States is militarily backing a regime which censors and surveils and harasses its own human rights activists. Saudis, if we would look at that issue, are the largest buyer of US weapons worldwide and get over 60% of their arms from the United States. You may remember back in September that the Biden administration announced this big new $500 million weapons sale to Saudi Arabia. And what happened with that was the deal triggered an outpouring of criticism from international human rights groups because of the Saudi regime's human rights abuses. And then beyond access to oil and counterterrorism, if we look at that last bullet point, we can see that US support for authoritarian regimes has a really long history going back in the Cold War based around the idea of containing communism. But since the 9/11 attacks, it's sort of shifted to containing Islamist movements instead. US policymakers, I've noticed, really refer to this point with terms like radical Islam or Islamic extremism, these blanket terms without much knowledge or context of specific militant movements, how they fit into the religious, social, political landscape of those countries. So the fixation on Islamist movements that are extreme or radical or militant sometimes will overshadow attention to other things that are happening, like the rise of agnostic and atheist identities in the region, also failing to provide insights into largely peaceful social movements that are carried out using religious Muslim identities as a vehicle. So we end up with this list here of a fairly narrow view of the region. We can go to the next slide. And this is sort of connecting us from those main interests to the main strategies pursuing those interests. So conventional strategies from the US-centric perspective of the region focus on using alliances with certain governments to try and manage the region in a way that supports what policymakers believe to be in line with those interests from the previous slide. And the alliances are then a way of exerting influence in the regional neighborhood, so to speak. So for example, there is that decades-long US alliance with Israel to prevent Arab countries from becoming too powerful and also to balance against Iran. And Israel is the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid since 1946. Most of that goes towards Israel's military. There's a US memorandum of understanding to provide Israel with roughly $3 billion per year, often more. And much of that is then used to purchase US military equipment and services, and also towards joint missile defense programs. One thing that I find interesting, not many people know, is that part of that agreement is that the United States also ensures any weapons it provides to other countries in the Middle East will never compromise, quote, Israel's qualitative military edge. So what that means is there's essentially an understanding that the US needs to ensure Israel has the most advanced military in the Middle East and has access to the most sophisticated weapons and the latest platforms, stealth fighters, all of those things. Israel gets around 80% of its weapons from the US, so it is heavily dependent on US arms imports. And part of these alliances are intended to secure what gets called US hegemony in the region, basically the dominance of the United States as the most powerful actor, including its partnership or friendship, as it's sometimes called, with the Israeli government. Especially as you may hear about Russia and China trying to expand their influence in the region, the conventional view from the US-centric lens is those kinds of alliances are a natural response to the US, shoring up its own power, trying to prevent Russia and China from building their own strength too much. Another one, if you're looking at that map in the lower part of the slide with those yellow circles that I've placed on there, it's just sort of calling attention to some of the main alliances. So we have Israel, we have the Saudi regime. If you notice in the northern part of Iraq, this is calling attention to another crucial ally from the US perspective, which is the non-state actor of the Kurds, the Kurdish group. And the Kurdish people, if you don't know, are a non-Arab ethnic group spread across several countries, Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran. And the idea is that the US partners with the Kurds to help do a few things to balance against Iran, which is a recurring theme in this lens, to fight against ISIS and other militant groups, which the Kurds have helped partner with US forces to do. And then in 2023, the US actually began building one of the world's largest US consulates in Erbil, in northern Iraq, as part of a commitment to just providing security to Iraqi Kurds and showing a kind of testament to the partnership with the Kurdistan Regional Government of Iraq. So that's something interesting because actually the Kurds often view that the United States has betrayed their partnership many times over the decades. But the US continues to worry about Arab countries being hostile to the United States and needing to sort of keep that hostility in check by allying with this non-Arab ethnic minority group spread across the region. And another conventional strategy that I've defined for you on the slide here is the concept of the proxy wars. And a proxy war is just a way of referring to indirect involvement in a conflict through the support of local actors and local parties in that conflict. Essentially, proxy wars become surrogate battles in which external powers can influence on the ground without directly being one of the parties at war. The devastating Syrian conflict, of course, has been enormously destructive since 2011, and that's often called an example of a proxy war in the region because Russia and Iran have offered backing to the Syrian Assad government regime, whereas the US has countered Russian and Iranian influence, backing groups fighting against Assad. And all of that got complicated with the entry of ISIS into the picture. So there's a lot that we can say for the proxy war lens with Syria. We can also apply it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because some analysts point to the Iranian government using Hamas as a proxy, providing funding and weapons and training to that Palestinian militant group, even though Iran is a Shia Muslim majority and Hamas is a Sunni Muslim majority non-state actor. They describe the alliance as a kind of marriage of convenience because Iran is understood as wanting to balance against the military power advantages of Israel and indirectly the United States. Also, we see proxy war, if you'll hear that sometimes referred to what's going on in Yemen, because the Saudi government and a coalition of Sunni Muslim Arab states for many years were countering Iranian influence by backing the Yemeni government against the Iranian-supported Shia Muslim Houthi groups in northern Yemen. One thing to keep in mind with all of these examples and this concept of proxy wars is that they can become a site of direct military conflict by those external actors. For example, we've seen this arguably in recent headlines with the US becoming more involved in carrying out strikes against groups in Syria and Yemen, directly carrying out those strikes rather than relying on the proxies. So we can go to the next slide. And here, now that we have established what I think are some of the major parameters of the traditional, conventional US-centric lens of foreign policy towards the region, we can ask ourselves, okay, so what would be the value of doing something different? What would be the value of an intercultural communication lens? How might we see things differently when we reorient ourselves to this other kind of approach? First, a bit of background on the intercultural communication approach. So within the history of cultural connections, there has been growing attention in recent decades to how different cultural contexts impact things like communication, diplomacy, conflict, even business and healthcare. In these arenas, we find that differences in things like how do people interpret things? What are the values that people hold? What are the norms that people follow, meaning informal expectations about what is right and morally appropriate to do? How do those kinds of things play an important role in shaping outcomes? And hopefully you're getting a sense from that list that's quite different than talking about balance of power and proxy wars. This is really taking seriously that culture matters and interpretations and ideas and beliefs matter and can play an important role in shaping policy outcomes. More recently, intercultural communication has helped scholars move beyond this nation-based approach to culture. And the problem with that nation-based approach is that it would oversimplify cultural identity, thinking in terms of things like a blanket Japanese culture or Chinese culture or Egyptian culture or American culture. Well, these nation-based approaches are oversimplifying how culture operates. And so there's a growing recognition that a lot of rich and complicated cultural context operates within countries. And so we also need to look within countries to understand their cultural differences, within one sort of nation state. That image on the top right is showing you Israeli anti-war protesters in Tel Aviv last month in January of 2024. And they are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. They're holding signs in Hebrew and Arabic that translate to "only peace will bring security." And the reason you have this image as a kind of example of breaking apart the nation-based view of culture is it's showing us there are so many divisions within Israeli Jewish groups, as well as Palestinian citizens in Israel and other religious and ethnic cleavages, that once we take that into account, we realize it's actually not helpful to speak of an Israeli culture or a Palestinian culture like it's one singular thing. It isn't even useful to think of just two sides in the conflict, Israeli versus Palestinian, because when we take into account all of those cultural fragmentations, collaborations, interactions that exist among Israelis, for one example, it's a much more complicated picture. And that lower image is referring to the same principle for looking at a neighboring country like Lebanon. And Lebanon, we would be troubled to speak of a singular, quote, Lebanese culture, because there are all these competing ethnic and religious identities that have very different interpretations and norms and values. And pictured here is this Maronite Christian leader, Bashar Butros-Sabrai, the leader of the largest Christian sect called the Maronites. And he has issued a number of statements criticizing Shia Lebanese Muslim approaches to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has also criticized Sunni Muslim Syrian refugees hosted in Lebanon and living in Lebanon. So when we would take into account those kinds of perspectives and the fact that we have Sunnis, Shias, Maronite Christians, many more, it would really disrupt our idea of, well, how do the Lebanese feel about X? What's the Lebanese approach to Y? Well, we really shouldn't blanket that kind of understanding or framing, right? We should think more of, well, let's go within these countries and look at all the different cultural, ethnic, and religious groups that are coexisting. How might they approach the conflict differently? So what we're getting from all of this here is that an intercultural communication lens can maybe help us find a better balance between analyzing patterns on a broad scale that might be dominant or prevalent in a country in the region. And then on the other hand, recognizing, well, there's also a lot of diverse, overlapping, maybe even conflicting cultural identities when we look beneath the surface of a country in the region. And we can go to the next slide. So when we look more closely at the cultural complexity beneath the surface, it helps us to understand why conflicts may be so protracted, why some of those alliances might fail to have their intended outcomes. And Syria is just one case where we can see numerous religious groups and ethnic groups within the small country. And that helps account for why the Syrian civil war and conflict and displacement issues have remained so challenging for so many years. That map is showing you with all of the different colors. Those are all different ethnic or religious minority groups living within the country. The Assad regime actually roots its power in the Alawi Shia group, which is yellow on the map if you're able to see that. And the Alawi, sometimes called the Alawites, are concentrated in those yellow areas in the Syrian map. But there's also Sunni Muslim Syrians in that shade of green, more widespread. And that is used by the Assad regime because they have a larger share of the Syrian population as a kind of boogeyman that if he is not kept in power, there will be Islamic extremists that take over the country. And we also see Christian minorities live across different parts of Syria, which reminds us the limitations if we view the Middle East only through a fixation on East versus West or Christianity versus Islam. And of course, there are Kurdish Syrians who are non-Arab and have their own unique identity and interests and concerns. All of this is actually helping underscore a broader point that we don't often think about in the US-centric lens of the region. And that is the role of this region historically as a crossroads of different cultures, different religions, and different perspectives. And that's why we really need to go back to history as well. We can go to the next slide. and get a little bit more of a sense of that historical context. Again, this isn't usually acknowledged in the conventional US-centric foreign policy approach to the region, but the Middle East has long been a site of multiculturalism and cultural globalization. Diverse cultures, again, meaning norms, values of geographically distant places and peoples, they have been interacting and shaping and influencing one another for centuries in the Middle East. And a prominent example that I often point to that many people don't know about is the translation movement, also sometimes called the Abbasid translation movement. And that took place across the Middle East and North Africa and Europe between the 8th and 13th centuries. And this involved Arab and Muslim and Jewish intellectuals interacting with European and Christian intellectuals, translating and interpreting Greek texts and other ancient texts of science and philosophy. And they were really producing knowledge and disseminating knowledge at the same time across the regions, which once again calls into this false divide between East versus West, because the understandings of science, technology, philosophy were really forged together during the translation movement and shaped by multiple interacting forces of diverse cultural and religious backgrounds. Those Arab and Muslim and Jewish scholars tended to add their own commentaries when they did the translations of the science and philosophy texts, and then passed that knowledge on to other generations who updated and added onto the commentaries and added onto the analyses. And what we learned from the research of this scholar that I've highlighted for you here, in case you wanted to learn more, I have a few of these resources scattered throughout the presentation tonight. But if you wanted to learn more about this sort of period, often called the Golden Age of Islam, and these intellectual exchanges, you could look at Benin Ziri, who is of Moroccan origins and a professor now at UC San Diego, and her book Beyond Orientalism. She follows specific examples of how porous and fluid the boundaries between East and West have long been in the Middle East by tracing this Moroccan intellectual named Al-Hajari all the way through the 16th and 17th centuries, and his very complex cultural identities as he navigated between Muslim and Christian and African and European and Central Asian political leaders. And so why would we need to focus on this? Well, in part, the answer would be when we study and learn these histories, that's actually when we can begin to approach the region from a place of respect and recognition, from a place of acknowledging contributions of the region to international relations and political thought, rather than from a sort of ethnocentric approach that assumes a Western or a US superiority. We can go to the next slide. As another kind of example underscoring that, sometimes people are surprised to learn that the oldest university currently in the world is University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco. While Europe was in the so-called Dark Ages, the Abbasid Caliphate of the 8th through 13th centuries was filled with cosmopolitanism, learning, intellectual exchange, and that's part of why it was dubbed the Golden Age of Islam. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin was established during that time by a young Muslim woman from Tunisia, from a wealthy family. Her name was Fatima al-Fihri in 859 AD. And both UNESCO and the Guinness World Records recognize Al-Qarawiyyin as the oldest continuing university in the world. It's still in use today. Oxford and Cambridge came a couple centuries later. The historic library at Al-Qarawiyyin has some of the texts of a famous scholar from the 14th century called Ibn Khaldun. And that's just one example of the many bright minds that gathered there, sharing knowledge on philosophy, grammar, math, music, medicine, astronomy. The blueprint of this university, by the way, was passed on to other structures of learning that were then emulated in Europe in the successive centuries. Also, the founding of the university, I think, by a woman tends to challenge common assumptions about the contribution of women to Muslim civilization. Al-Fihri, she was well educated, and she was also a devout Muslim. And through what she created, the transfer of knowledge between Muslims of North Africa and the Middle East was really nourished and valued and spread into Europe. We can go to the next slide. So we can also expand our engagement with thinkers and theories that have contributed to Islamic thought to help us with this intercultural perspective, to gain a richer sense of the cultural contributions of the Middle East. These include intellectuals like Ibn Rushd, pictured in this book image in the top of the slide. Ibn Rushd is also sometimes called Averroes, so you'll hear that version of his name as well. And then that bust in the lower right there, Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is sometimes called the world's first sociologist because he pioneered a lot of thinking in what some link with today's kind of concepts of sociology. There's also another book, just as an additional resource if you're interested to learn more, down here, Reimagining International Relations. This is a book by Barry Buzan and Amitav Acharya, and they engage with some of these concepts of Islamic thought in one of their chapters in the book as well. So just a few examples. Asabiya, well, this is a concept that's actually transcending the idea of blood-based or ethnic origins, or what we would think of today as nationalism. It's a little more nuanced than that. It's more transnational because it's an idea of social solidarity that can go beyond the borders of a certain territory. So this is helping us think, maybe beyond balancing and great power politics and proxy wars, asabiya, a transnational social solidarity, could be important to the politics of the region if there's a shared purpose and a shared bond between a group of people. That was a concept that Ibn Khaldun, in his philosophy of history in the late 1300s, really foregrounded. And he theorized that asabiya was really strong at the start of a civilization or an empire. And then over time, as it declined, the empire also declined. And it changed and became replaced with other versions of asabiya, other versions of feelings of social solidarities that new leaders were able to cultivate. And so we also see a related concept here with the concept below, the ummah. And the ummah is just referring to political community, again, beyond the territorial state or country. It's more like a social belonging through religious identity. So religion and the state are sort of heavily fused together and intertwined in these visions. The head of the state might be a governor and administrator, and maybe also a spiritual leader. But in practice, the Islamic caliphates usually ruled things very separately. So it's more like a theoretical vision of the ummah that doesn't always happen in practice. But we are getting a sense from asabiya and from ummah as these concepts of Islamic thought that community is really important, that community, not necessarily territory, could be envisioned as really key to political authority and to governance, and also that religion could be intertwined with political and legal structures rather than needing to be strictly separated out. And Muslim scholars have argued about these principles and their application today, but they tend to agree that world politics can really vary in the levels of unity or fragmentation, depending on how leaders are able to tap into things like asabiya or to make the ummah feel like it is united over a cause. For example, maybe the Palestinian cause in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A couple others, if you wanted to jot them down to just learn more. Ijtihad is another one. It's sort of a sense of how, despite that fusion of religion and governance, there has always been this pathway for independent reasoning within Islam, for scientific, philosophical expertise to be used to problem solve. And the notion here is that, religious texts, even if one were to be very devout, would never provide all of the answers to all of the challenges that come up in life. So ijtihad would elevate having a mental effort through reasoning and through logic for approaching a problem. And this last concept I think is very interesting, the Dar al-Ahad, because sometimes for people that study Islamic thought, they focus on, well, there was this division of Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, the areas ruled by Muslims and the areas ruled by non-Muslims. But there was also a third concept, which can apply to international relations today, the Dar al-Ahad, which referred to areas that were governed by treaties of non-aggression. So even if they were not ruled by Muslims, Muslims might still feel safe to trade and interact and have diplomatic relations in the Dar al-Ahad because there were peace treaties that were negotiated to help protect them. So basically, these Islamic theorists, even centuries ago, had visions for intercultural contact and coexistence among different religious and civilizational groups, governed by peace treaties that enabled a relatively peaceful number of centuries of trade and economic exchange and commercial merchants that were able to move freely in different areas that had different religious beliefs. By the way, all of these concepts are heavily debated among scholars, and they're really more complex than I can do justice to in this moment of a presentation. But I hope it helps you to understand there isn't just this one unified view of how to govern or what social belonging looks like, because there's so much diversity of thought involved in the different cultures and religious exchanges in this area. I think it's only when we begin to engage with these kinds of cross-cultural principles, even if it means, learning new words and new languages, that we can really start to grapple with other voices and other sources of potential knowledge that have been neglected in our dominant lens of how we approach the region. Again, beyond balancing and beyond grand strategy and hegemony and proxy wars, what about building social solidarity? What about tapping into the importance of feelings of community and the ummah? What about problem solving and negotiating treaties? If we go to the next slide, I would also say that rooting our approach to the region in a more cross-cultural lens and a less US-centric perspective could reveal a much more complex web of social relations with structures of politics of the Middle East that don't fit within the traditional paradigm. So we see numerous cultural interactions and recognize a lot more mobilization and influence is unfolding at the local level when we take this into account. Within domestic spaces and countries, there are movements that are not easily contained. A lot of them are transnational. They also spill across borders. Despite the efforts of governments in the region to maybe try and control the flow of information. For example, you see following the death of the Kurdish Iranian woman, Mahsa Jina Amini, in this lower left image here, who was killed at the hands of Iranian authorities in 2022. Well, the protests over her treatment and over her death spilled over to neighboring populations like groups within Turkey, who pictured here were commemorating the anniversary of Amini's killing last year, still keeping that alive and what it means for the treatment of women, what it means for human rights and for freedom. And also when we look beyond the US grand strategy kind of focus on maintaining hegemony and maintaining US interests, we start to open up really interesting pathways for civil society actors, which are just ordinary citizens basically in the region who end up organizing themselves to create their own forms of governance. And this is something beyond the formal official country or a formal official state as it's called. They often do this to address gaps in things like social services and infrastructure. And this image on the lower right is just giving you a connection as an example to Lebanon's informal bus system, which fills gaps where formal public transportation has fallen short in the country, particularly with the destruction of infrastructure as part of the Lebanese Civil War in the 1990s. But people locally organize their own informal public transport system, very loosely regulated, without a specific schedule of stops necessarily or a unified operator of the buses, but really just operating wherever there was demand and making use of whatever resources and operators were available and would volunteer. It's often discussed as being more affordable and relatively efficient, despite all the flaws of not being a formal government structured public transportation. And that's just one example of how people on the ground in these countries often take forms of governance into their own hands when their leaders are failing them. We don't necessarily find that the collapse or weakness of state institutions, government institutions, produces the same result in every country. So just keep that in mind. But there will be a lot of diversity in how local leaders and inhabitants respond and find alternate ways of keeping social goods functioning and moving forward, even when their own governments are failing to do so. So this is suggesting to us we need to pay more attention to what's happening at the grassroots civil society level in these countries to see how people are continuously mobilizing and organizing themselves despite government repression. And if we go to the next slide, we could see a related takeaway for the US-centric lens. Kind of, we need to question, I would say, how we know what we think we know, right? What we might call knowledge production, how we know what we think we know about the politics of the Middle East. And part of that is asking ourselves, well, which experiences are silenced, or which experiences get elevated? How do we know what we think we know about the Arab uprisings, often called the Arab Spring in the US context, during and after that 2011 juncture? You know, where did we get our understanding of these uprisings and what it means, what their status is? For many US analysts and commentators, the narrative is that the goal was a liberal, Western style democratic transition in those Arab uprisings, and that ultimately then failed. They're often talked about as a failure or a disappointment by US-based commentators. But when we move away from the US-centric lens of the region, the Arab uprisings of 2011 appear less like a failure or a disappointment. What actually some analysts have said, the Arab Spring turned into an Arab winter, even using that metaphor. But instead, they appear as something messy and complex that's just one step in a political transition within those landscapes. And this is where the Arabic word for these uprisings, called thawra, comes into play, because the Arabic thawra, it's more akin to a revolution as a longer term conflictual process, rather than this blanket seasonal change like a spring or a winter. And thawra in Arabic acknowledges the agency, the sacrifices, the activism of the protesters on the ground, all of the individual activities and life and death decisions that they needed to embark on to try and have those movements towards change. So then it's not really just failures of the uprisings to produce a kind of liberal democratic outcome desired by the US. When we elevate the perspectives of those protesters and activists in the region who participated in those movements and suffered the consequences of their aftermath, we see really different angles on the story. In the top right pictured here is Egyptian blogger and human rights activist Wael Abbas. This is an example of one of those activists who has also suffered the consequences. He wrote about the torture by the Egyptian police. He wrote about and shared videos of the beatings they were carrying out, other forms of corruption. His Twitter account was shut down temporarily. He also had his YouTube account suspended. He was arrested in 2018 with a group of other human rights activists by the Egyptian authorities, and since then has continuously feared for his safety, continuously been harassed by the Egyptian government. So his story, Wael Abbas, his story, and the story of other protesters throughout the region, it's not really stories of failures and disappointments, as we may come to hear about them in the US. You could instead understand these stories as stories of courage, agency, empowerment, and highly adaptable techniques of trying to constantly maneuver when you're facing a heavily censoring government and a heavily repressive government. And if you look at this image on the left here, these are protesters in Martyrs Square in Beirut, Lebanon, more recently in 2019. And we're reminded that Lebanon's thawra, or revolution, focused on the corruption of the government with a very broad group of Lebanese people who mobilized together. They actually overcame their sectarian divisions to open up new spaces for different kinds of solidarity, like the asabiya, right? Different kinds of solidarity that transcended ethnic-based or blood-based. And they overcame those sectarian divisions to really base things more around their interests, like class or group, like associations of professionals, unions, women. And they've really been at the forefront of those protests in Lebanon. So that simplistic view of the region as just, constantly mired in the Sunni versus Shia sectarian division that can never be overcome, that actually misses a lot of the bridges that are already made across the sectarian categories by people on the ground in the Middle East. They're able to shift and adjust their identities right? They're able to build new versions of feelings of asabiya, of social solidarity, in order to come together in certain contexts. And then in the next slide, it's actually me giving you another resource in case you wanted to learn more, if this piqued your interest. Many of these points about the Arab uprisings that I'm saying now, and how the US and the British think tanks and policymakers really misunderstood and mischaracterized them, are highlighted in the work of Dr. Jasmine Ghani. Dr. Ghani is at the University of St. Andrews in the UK, and she has this article, which I believe is available right now to download for free. So if you were inspired by the presentation and you want to read more, it's called Discourse, From Discourse to Practice, Orientalism, Western Policy, and the Arab Uprisings. And it's in the Journal of International Affairs. And I believe it's free access right now that you can download the PDF if you wanted to dig a little deeper into some of these things here. I've been inspired by Dr. Ghani's research to ask myself, what else are we missing? What else are we misinterpreting and overlooking? Because if we got the interpretation of the Arab uprising so wrong, what else are we missing because we sort of have blinders on based on this conventional US-centric approach to foreign policy strategy in the region? And then we can go to the next slide. This is sort of another way of reframing our lens of how we're studying the Middle East away from the US-centric conventional approach, not just focusing on failures to produce liberal democratic outcomes, which is often a fixation for those based in the US, but more like a continuous effort, a continuous movement by civil society groups, by ordinary people who are coping with intense government repression. We're talking about spyware, selective content moderation in social media, other forms of sophisticated, very sophisticated, high-tech digital surveillance. And so this is another resource if you just are interested to learn more, because I don't really have time to do it full justice in this presentation. I found that this report is available for free download from POMEPS. So that's the Project on the Middle East Political Science, POMEPS. And the report is called Digital Activism and Authoritarian Adaptation in the Middle East. And so this one really goes in depth at all the kinds of examples of the technologically sophisticated digital surveillance being carried out on those who are trying to work towards human rights and democracy every day in the Middle East. And a lot of the repressive tools, by the way, that are used by the autocratic governments in the Middle East to harass and control their own citizens, these are actually coming from US-based and Western-based private companies, and in some cases, Israeli surveillance firms. So comprehensive surveillance is arguably a social norm in the region. The governments are using AI to assess trends and threats in the social movements among the people that might in any way undermine the government power. And that really creates a kind of political context that makes transition towards democracy and support for human rights, really even basic freedom of expression, incredibly difficult and in new tech-savvy ways. I think that's a really important point to underscore, because rather than being rooted in some backward, traditionalist, religious, fundamentalist kind of obstacle to democracy or human rights, which I have found the US-centric lens tends to fixate on and associate with the Islamist movements. We could instead see this angle of the story in which transitions towards democracy and freedom are actually hindered by very high-tech, advanced, sophisticated, westernized kind of surveillance on the people, aided by these corporations. Again, rather than irreconcilable differences in values or cultures, we could see resentment towards the US resulting from its role in the policies and actions that behave contrary to the spirit of freedom and democracy, a kind of double standard in which the US proclaims to promote freedom and liberty and human rights, but in its actions is often perceived by people on the ground who are risking their lives for that freedom and democracy as doing the opposite, right? As being contrary to what is said, the deeds being opposite or contrary to the words, so to speak. And again, that would be justified from the US policymakers' perspective when that's happening as well. We're trying to secure, access to oil and gas and maintaining our counterterrorism partnerships and, preventing Islamist movements from gaining too much popularity in the region. One thing to keep in mind with that you might want to think about is when things like Islamist movements get deemed the enemy, in part because they are trying to challenge their own repressive and abusive governments, or to call attention to US foreign policy double standards, there is a very real chance that those efforts to undermine Islamist groups backfires, right? And it ends up empowering them because then they emerge as a true kind of perceived resistance, right, to repression. So that's another thing is sometimes what is understood as rational by policymakers, if you look from a different angle, can have an outcome where it actually seems quite irrational. And the next slide will help take us to one last point here. And this is about the point of violence, right? Especially because of the US focus on counterterrorism. So with the intercultural communication lens, we might reframe the question to ask, who is the perpetrator and who is the victim? How is that interpreted differently? And we find the answers to the questions when we decenter the US policy perspective really change. So rather than focusing on terrorist threats in terms of primarily viewing them as a threat to US interests or overseas attacks targeting Americans, we can see that many threats from terrorism are faced by the people who live directly in the countries where those groups have been active and actively targeting the local populations. You can see in this top right image on the slide here, this is an image from one of the major deadly terror attacks that's occurred in recent years, one of the deadliest that has been carried out by local Muslim populations. ISIS carried out this attack in 2014 near Tikrit in northwest of Baghdad in Iraq, and it involved the killing of roughly 1,700 unarmed Iraqi Air Force cadets, including many Shia Muslims. And the image is showing one of the mass graves at the site, also called the Camp Spiker Massacre. And I would recommend checking out in the lower right here, it's a little screenshot from a video. It's a BBC interview with one of the survivors of the massacre. His name is Ali Hussein Khadim. So if you just search Camp Spiker Massacre BBC, it comes up right away. It's very clear when you watch the interview with Ali how traumatized he still is all of these years later, as he describes what it was like to survive laying still within a pile of dead bodies covered in the blood of his colleagues. And he was actually pretending to be dead for hours as the bodies around him decayed. And he kept thinking of his family, trying to keep himself still so it would appear as though he were not alive, to keep himself safe. Well, these kinds of stories are so powerful, but there's been a lot less attention to them in the United States. Many people in the US didn't even hear of the Camp Spiker massacre site from 2014. There has been, a lot of attention to Americans as victims of violence and Muslims or Arabs as the attackers and the perpetrators of the violence, rather than how also they are victims of violence. So it becomes, easier for the US audience to see Americans as the victims that need to be protected, rather than seeing how Middle Eastern populations themselves are also victims, also live in fear, also feel that they need to be protected. And then if we look at this upper left image, it's sort of getting at another angle of the victims of violence question, because when we alter our lens to look more through the perspectives of people living in the region, we see the fear of violence is not just fear of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but it also includes fear of violence from things like US drone strikes targeting those groups, US-sponsored attacks targeting militant groups that accidentally end up killing a lot of civilians in the process. So there are people who live in these villages in Yemen, for example, that live in this sort of constant sense of community trauma. And that's because there have been so many attacks where they have lost loved ones or it hit their home by accident, something like that. The image here in the top left is showing you coverage by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism on a 2017 drone attack in rural Yemen. It was aimed at killing Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP militants. But in the process, it also killed 25 civilians, 9 children who were under the age of 13. It's really hard to do because we like to just think of a kind of black and white understanding of counterterrorism and good guys and bad guys. But if we just try to imagine the perspectives of people living in rural Yemen who often lack a voice and lack a means of having their stories, reach the top of the news agenda, then we could see the portrait of what we think of as counterterrorism really differently. And the consequences of the policy strategies of counterterrorism emerge in a really different light. And the US then might be seen by people in the region as actually being the aggressor and the attacker and the one who is doing the terrorizing to those villages. This is, again, almost impossible, just from human nature and psychology for most of us most of the time to really consider. But if we just try to alter our vantage point, then we can better understand how people in the region could see these stories differently. And we could start to gain a fuller picture, a more accurate picture, I would say, of what is happening, why people feel and act the way they do, and why it actually seems quite rational from their perspective to think and feel as they do. And on to the next slide here. So the last part I wanted to do with the presentation was kind of bring things into a concrete example with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do see a bit more coverage now of different perspectives on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For a lot of decades, those who studied depictions in the US media found very strong levels of favoring humanization more of the Israeli narratives rather than Palestinian narratives as part of the decades-long US alliance with Israel. But we do see a little more elevation in recent years of the kinds of violence that Palestinians are facing, and some recognition Palestinians are not just attackers, not just perpetrators. They also live in daily experiences in which they're victims of insecurity. This infographic is done by Al Jazeera. It's showing us kind of statistics of violence suffered by Palestinians in Gaza as part of the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. And we saw, a lot of the coverage from October carried out by those Hamas militants carrying out those attacks. For many people, it sort of justified everything that came after, right? The fact that over 1,200 Israelis were killed and over 200 hostages taken is sort of justified, well, whatever the Israeli government then is doing in Gaza. But for Palestinians living in Gaza, there is this daily feeling of insecurity, of never being able to feel safe or sleep soundly or have secure access to food and basic hygiene. So this conflict in particular, I would say, is especially challenging and crucial as an opportunity to engage in trying to take different perspectives and understand different angles of all of the groups and all of the cultural contexts that are involved. And if we go to the next slide, this is sort of an idea of also how can we go beyond the numbers, because you might look at those infographics all day, also, infographics on the deaths and suffering of Israelis, right? And it still doesn't bring home the same kind of, I would say, intrinsic feeling that comes from understanding more personalized accounts. So, what does it mean that roughly 1,200 or 1,400 lives are lost among Israelis? Or what does it mean that 27,000 or 28,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza? How do we even wrap our minds around those kinds of figures and numbers? So an intercultural communication approach, I think, would help us here to balance out those inundations of statistics of destruction of infrastructure and wounded and deaths with the human names, the human faces, the unique human stories of the real people that are affected. There's so much diversity among millions of Palestinian refugees, for example. Palestinian refugees, of course, they lack their own sovereign country. They have this feeling of never having a secure or enduring home. And it's very difficult to imagine what that is like, especially if you have an identity very, very much linked to, where you are from or the space that you live in. But one way that you could start to get at that kind of perspective is by exploring some of the work of Palestinians who express what that's like. So I would recommend just one example could be looking at artwork by Palestinians who try and express their experiences through art. So Malak Matar is one example I have included here. She's in Gaza and has very powerful artwork, sort of, again, expressing her experience, which varies from Palestinian to Palestinian, but her own kind of feeling, making sense of what it's like to be displaced without a homeland. You might also explore some of the unique perspectives of Palestinian poets, like the top image here. This is Mahmoud Darwish, who passed away in 2008, but he wrote so many books of poetry prior to his death that you could read for years and still not get through it all, where he's articulating for him what it meant to be Palestinian living in the diaspora globally. So not just in these countries in the region where millions of Palestinian refugees live, but the broader exiled kind of diaspora of Palestinians living in different countries around the world. What it was like for him with that vantage point to be part of the struggle or the resistance, traveling and visiting, never really secured in a home. And then if you go to the next slide, it's giving you a little bit of a glimpse of other kinds of diverse and complicated perspectives. So these might be perspectives from Israelis, like Yulia Novak, the executive director of the B'Tselem human rights group. And she and that group have often been targeted and harassed by the Israeli government for its activism in support of Palestinian human rights. Also the stories like the one on the right of Chen Alon, who is a former Israeli military officer who refused to serve in the early 2000s because of his objections to Israeli policies in Gaza and the West Bank. Well, he went on to become the co-founder of Combatants for Peace, which is a group that includes former fighters, both from Palestinian and Israeli nationalities, who now advocate for dialogue and advocate for intercultural understanding. They face tremendous opposition in many of their communities. And it connects back to a common theme that I think we're seeing this evening of citizens themselves organizing and mobilizing in the grassroots level within the region. And they're often doing it at great risk to themselves and their livelihoods because they're doing it in opposition to the governments in those regions. They feel their government may be unwilling or unable to do the right thing from their perspective. If we are just looking at, balancing behavior of great powers, the use of proxy wars by external actors to play some chess game for power across the region, we would miss these kinds of perspectives, and we would miss how social organizing is happening every day at these local and transnational levels. And then the next slide is kind of as we wrap up here, what are we taking away then? What would be the goal to take away from an intercultural communication approach? It would probably look like something called this notion of intercultural competence. Now, this has been proposed based on how well someone can manage their emotions, dealing with divisive issues. What is their awareness level about themselves and about other cultures? So maybe one goal or one takeaway would be, can we work towards talking about divisive and sensitive issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and communicate together while managing our emotions and realizing others have very different and equally strong principles and emotions in a similar way. And perhaps the second goal would be to increase our awareness about other cultures and other perspectives which differ from our own, so that we could see those different angles, so that we might start to cultivate a willingness to respect intercultural difference, to start our point of analysis of the region, like the Middle East, more from a place of cultural sensitivity and openness to learning about knowledge systems and norms which are, unfamiliar or seem strange or seem different. And also to have intercultural competence, I think we would not only need those communication skills, but we need the strong knowledge. We need the education about other cultures. We have to be mindful and self-aware. How can we overcome our own ethnocentrism? How can we overcome our own anxiety, which is a very natural anxiety of the stranger, right? The stranger who is unfamiliar, who seems really different, and maybe even seems very threatening to us. Those with strong intercultural competence tend to be able to manage that kind of anxiety around the stranger. And that is the way that they are then able to do things like build rapport, have clear communication, build trust, be willing to engage with, translations, other ways of sharing cultural knowledge, other languages. We have seen already, by the way, many Israelis and Palestinians doing this in the current conflict. If you look at this image on the top left, you see Dr. Lina Hassan, a Palestinian citizen of Israel, second from the left there. And Dr. Hassan treats Jewish citizens through her work with a mobile clinic arranged by the Physicians for Human Rights in Israel. And this is from an interview she did with NPR. And she was describing her human relationship with her patients who are Jewish. Again, she's Palestinian, but as her relatives even were facing threat, and she lost a relative in Gaza, who was an ambulance driver that was killed during one of the Israeli airstrikes, still she was able to root her approach in this human response, rather than turning to vengeance, which first and foremost I would say is probably the most natural response most people would have, is to turn to vengeance, right? Instead, she felt that these Jewish people that she was treating, her patients, still deserve life and deserve to be treated with care, rather than just seeing them as the enemy because the Israeli state was carrying out these airstrikes. And she does that even as she's traveling to Gaza every month with the mobile clinic, and she's seeing the hunger and anemia and malnutrition among the Gazan children, still that she's able to humanize Israelis and not just see them as the stranger or the aggressor, or an IDF officer or a settler using violence against her family. I think that perspective for me would be one of the hardest to imagine, and maintaining that level of humanization of the so-called enemy when your own loved ones are being killed or injured really raises the bar for those of us that are not directly losing loved ones every day, to at very least, can we work on building our cultural knowledge? And at the very least, can we work on understanding different perspectives, which might seem unfamiliar to us? So this last slide is to just provide you with some questions if you wanted to say, well, how can I really use this moving forward after tonight? These are some questions I think we can always be asking ourselves when we study these kinds of issues and topics. When we're carrying out our own look into foreign policy events, because I know many of the people that tune into this series are very well informed and are hungry for that kind of knowledge. And that is to be attuned to that concept of knowledge production I mentioned before. How do we know what we think we know about these issues? So first, right, can we ask ourselves how the story being told might have been shaped by the winners on that issue or in world politics, by certain powerful countries or powerful actors that have more advantages in their position? What if the story was told by the losers who were weaker, who were less powerful, who had different vantage points on that issue? How might that story be told differently? And that could be especially useful if we're analyzing a conflict. Is the victorious party in that conflict getting to shape the narrative more? Why they deserve to win, why the losers deserve to lose, why they were on the side of righteousness and morality and the losers were on the side of evil. Second, and very related to the first question, can we try to identify who are the dominant voices that have been telling these stories? Maybe within our social network, our media consumption habits, the narratives of our elected officials. Right? Can we detect that there are some who are more dominant than others, their voices heard more often than others? And if so, then can we search out, well, who are the neglected and overlooked voices that we're not hearing from as much? How do we understand the issue differently if we would engage those more neglected, less visible kinds of perspectives? Maybe the dominant voices have been accepted as virtuous and advanced, and the less dominant have been dismissed, as primitive or backwards or violence, or, well, they don't have anything important to say. It could be that those voices actually just have trouble sharing their perspectives because, well, maybe they're in detention centers, they're being monitored or surveilled heavily by their own government, or they risk a threat to their lives or the lives of their families if they speak out. And then third, we can ask ourselves, and this is very important for the intercultural competence part, what is our own vantage point? What is our frame of reference of how we think there might be a normal, rational way to approach the issue? It could be shaped by our cultural context and our position, both internationally, if we have the privilege of being based in the US, or locally, our social networks, our political and community norms, our family, our upbringing, religious, cultural, ethnic backgrounds. Even sometimes, our professional networks, military experience, missionary work, all of those things, can really end up shaping one's vantage point, right? So who do we view as strange and unfamiliar in a conflict? Um, how might that be shaping the way that we're interpreting it, and what we think the right outcome would be? So I know that these are not easy questions, but if you can just start to think of even a few of these in the future, when you're reading or hearing of these issues, I think it would go a long way. So thank you for your patience and listening, and I'm happy to take some questions now.
All right, I'm going to actually add myself back in. Oh, where did you go? I unintentionally took you out. I'm sorry about that. Um, oh, what an absolutely fantastic lecture. Thank you so much. There is so much to unpack there, um, which is great. I mean, honestly, and I'm not usually the quietest person, but it was just phenomenal to take all this information in. I would recommend, if you noted a lot of sources and you put a couple of books in here. If anyone would like a copy of the PowerPoint, please contact me. There is my email address at work, tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. Please get in touch with me, and I will send it to you. And there's just a lot of information in here. Someone had asked a question, or made a comment. Virginia wondered, please repeat the sources of additional info. I'm not exactly sure which additional info, but for the broader view of it, getting in touch with me to get the PowerPoint is a good jumping off point. Would you like to give any of these back to you? I'm going to switch to the bigger picture view. I know it's not your favorite thing, but it is more of what people came to see.
Thank you so much, Tim. Yeah, for those sources, I think two of the sources were actually slides 12 and 13. Had two of the specific titles of the reports and articles. So maybe that's where it might be especially helpful to pull those up. Slide 12 with From Discourse to Practice with Dr. Ghani.
Okay, let me bring slide 12. Okay, 1 second. I'm actually going to have to leave. Wait, no, I won't. Tell me when I get there.
Sounds good.
Okay,
they're right there. Oh. Yeah, you were right there. That's it. Yeah. So this was the first one where it might take a moment if someone were taking notes to write it down. And so that's her information, right? Is Dr. Jasmine Ghani. And then this article in particular, I thought could be a good resource because when I had last checked, it was available as a PDF to download from the journal International Affairs. And so that's that title of it. And she really goes into the misunderstandings of the Arab uprisings from the US and the UK perspective, and how because they were coming at it from a very narrow lens based on their own foreign policy interests, they missed a lot of the richer meaning of what was going on. And then if you just go to the next slide, or actually I think the other way, yeah, that's the one. Yeah, this might be the other one if people were trying to take notes of additional resources. I think because the title is so long, and so that you see that full title of the report, right? Digital Activism and Authoritarian Adaptation in the Middle East. And so that POMEPS report number 43, that whole thing, they have all of those reports are free and accessible to the public. Really, this is a plug then, not just for that report. In general, I think POMEPS is a great resource for people trying to understand Middle East politics and international affairs that isn't just, that US foreign policy dominant perspective we hear, because a lot of the people that contribute are on the ground. They are researchers, they are scholars, even living in the region or from the region, or, with connections to the area very closely. And so they give, I think, very fresh perspectives. And a lot of the articles in those are quite short. So, it won't be like an overwhelming amount like books or something like that. So yes, I would recommend the POMEPS. If once you go to their site, you can download all of the free latest issues they have of their articles by their scholars. I think those two were probably that would have, needed a little more time maybe for
Sure.
people taking notes on resources. Um, if you though wanted to go to one of the last slides, they might be interested in that Palestinian artist and that Palestinian poet. Yeah, right there. So that artist's name is Malak Matar. That's an example of her artwork pictured next to her. And then that poet who passed away, Mahmoud Darwish, right? And that's one of his books. He has so many books, even on Amazon. You can just, if you search Mahmoud Darwish. So, like I said, if you're interested in poetry, if that's the kind of way that speaks to you to engage other perspectives is through the literary kind of approach, that would be just one starting point.
I love that art that you included. I mean, just the different influences that are present is incredible. But that also, speaks to what you were talking about of like it's just not one thing. We tend to think of, and not just in artwork or even culturally what we think of one thing, but everyone wants the one big answer that provides perfect clarity, and there is no such thing. There isn't.
There
And
isn't, and that's so hard. I mean, you're so right, Tim, to bring that up because that's so hard. In my position, I'm often asked, like, "Well, what are the three things?" Or, "Well, what's the answer?" And I think that's part of the problem is that we are primed to have things told to us in a simple, easily digested, packaged way because that's what officials like in their campaigns. They tend to do that. And it resonates because then people feel like, oh, I get that. That's easy, but then it's often not accurate. And so that's the thing is the harder path is usually the more accurate path, and the harder path is really messy and it's full of gray areas and it's full of sometimes more questions than answers. But if we're really trying to grapple with the truth and real knowledge and real understanding, that's what I found is you have to go the hard way, the long, hard way.
I saw a play one time, and it was just a dumb musical theater play. I mean, it really was dumb. It was supposed to be dumb, but there was a line in it. What you were just saying, the truth is so important, but the truth is such a slippery thing. Was a line in that musical, and it really is. One of the people that organizes the Great Decisions, Darlene Wellner, we've had conversations just on how important it is to listen because even if you don't agree with everything that's being said, you gain perspective. And gaining perspective, it's a long path. It's not just sitting down and taking a, if it was as easy as eating a sandwich, everyone would get along, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hard. And I understand too, people are so busy in their lives that it's hard to read everything and absorb everything. And that's why I do plug, even though I'm a political scientist and I work with a lot of data and analyzing and reading, but I do plug that personal kind of humanizing approach. It's just a way that you can connect on a more fundamental level, at the level of the soul, I think through art, through poetry, even through storytelling, there are a lot of writers who are just in a more simple, easy to digest, non-political science language, can sometimes have a really big effect then for people to connect with what it would mean to be in their shoes or what it would mean to have that perspective.
Almost certainly. And if you're capable, traveling also. You had
Yeah.
a good fortune to study in Egypt. I was an exchange student, and it granted Western. I lived in Belgium for a year when I was a senior in high school. But the perspective of what an American is when you're outside of America, even in a country like Belgium that has huge American influence, is completely different than what you think it's going to be, especially when you're 17 and you're still kind of buying into what you've been fed. It's
Absolutely,
amazing.
Tim. Yeah. And I mean, I would also just plug again for, some people already naturally are exposed to different languages and grow up around different languages. But for those who are not, who really just have like that one language, or if it's US based, English or something, challenging yourself when you take on other languages at any age, it's a humbling experience. And I think it's one of the quickest ways to what intercultural communication is getting at, because you start to realize that whole sense of superiority and confidence that, this is the best way. It starts to slip from your grips when you are humbled to try and understand, all these other vocabularies and maybe even scripts, if it's a non-Latin language.
Oh yeah.
Just that humbling experience. I wish that even our elected officials, had to study multiple languages or something before they go in to make a foreign policy decisions, because I think it would do a lot.
Most definitely. I I started a little too late. We took a trip to Italy, and I started a little too late to try and learn some useful, just everyday Italian, and I managed to learn some. But calling it a humbling experience is super accurate. It really is. But I loved the struggle of it too. It was important, to me. But um, you know, let's take some questions, because there are questions coming in, and I don't want it just to be the Tim show talking about stuff he's done. So this was asked during actually um, Janet had a question. As a Quaker who knows there are peace activists in Palestine, Israel, what is the role of the peace activists?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's another really rich perspective to bring in from the Quaker background. There are so many peace groups that for years have been working really hard to overcome divisions within their own societies and then across societies in Israel and Palestine. Standing together is one that I would recommend looking into right now if you wanted to look at the role of the peace activists in the current Israel-Hamas war. Standing together was featured on that slide, I think, that I had showed you early on, with the Israelis in Tel Aviv that were holding banners in Arabic and Hebrew that there can be no security through peace. And so I think that's also kind of a good sum up of what the peace activist perspective is usually trying to convey, that it's not that the peace activist does not value security, and it's not that the peace activist also doesn't have fear, for the safety of their loved ones and their family and children, but that they actually find those paths towards peace are the most important way to keep themselves and their families safe. And that's why, the slogans of the Standing Together group, there will be no security without peace. Well, they're suggesting that the Israeli government's response is so disproportionate and so heavy-handed or vengeful on the Palestinian, largely civilian areas oftentimes, that it's doing more damage to the security of the state of Israel
Hmm.
than it's doing for protecting the safety of Israelis. And so again, I think it's the peace activists. Maybe part of the role would be that it's not that security doesn't matter, that's like a false dichotomy of you're either for peace or you're for like a strong, aggressive approach to security, because the peace activists perceive themselves and what they're doing as serving security in the long term.
Excellent, excellent information. Thank you. The next comment, I wish there was more that had been said to round it out, because it's very hard to live in Arab countries, in my opinion, and I wish we had more to go along with that. But I mean, you addressed that to a certain degree already, but uh, if you're still watching, add some more on, if you can. But I'll
And
let
it
you.
could be that um, because I'm just thinking about how it's phrased, it's very hard to live. It could be because so many of the examples in tonight's presentation, getting at the civil society work, the grassroots, ordinary people that are trying to fight for these principles like human rights and basic freedoms or moves towards democracy, how hard it is for them to live in these oppressive environments. So it could be they were kind of picking up on that example after example, like Wael Abbas, the Egyptian human rights activist, or those protesters that end up, risking their lives to protest. That it's sort of like, yes, it is so hard to be living in these countries under these oppressive regimes with their high-tech surveillance today, especially, and AI tracking of social movements. It is incredibly hard. And if one is not in a context where it's that hard to live, then it can be a real challenge to even imagine what it's like to wake up in the morning and not know if you have that freedom of expression, or if the person following you is actually a plainclothes, security guard who's monitoring you, and once you're alone is going to, take you in the back of the van and take you to the detention center, which, often happens to activists.
Definitely. I mean, you wonder, if anyone is an activist for whatever cause they believe in, is it more difficult, say, in the East and in the Middle East than it is in the West? And I would the answer be yes? I mean, from what it, I'll just ask an additional question. Would you say, because of what you were saying, do you believe it is more difficult to stand up for what you believe in the Middle East or Eastern
Yes,
countries?
yes, yes. I mean, well, because I wouldn't want to go so far as Eastern, because then once we start getting
Okay,
into
yeah,
the Asian countries, there's so much diversity of
true,
Japan versus China and so on. But if just
right.
the Middle East, kind of those regional geographic parameters, yes, like there is so that is a main theme, right? Is the theme of government repression, and the theme of heavy surveillance of people that are trying to do anything to challenge those governments.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's such a privilege then if you're in a context where you can be a researcher or an activist, or even just an ordinary citizen expressing your views against your government, to live in a country where you can do that. It's a real privilege that a lot of people say they're not interested in politics, or they don't follow politics, but that's also a privilege too, right? If you don't have to, that means that, like, it's okay. Whereas a lot of people living in these countries in the region, there's no choice. If they could choose, it would be great not to
Mhm.
be political, right? But it's really just, it's life or death, or it's having security or not security, or basic freedoms or not.
And I should stay on topic, right? Instead of expanding it beyond an already expansive topic. So sorry about wandering further east than I should have when I was speaking there. But um, also just some compliments for you. Great presentation. Completely agree from Janet and Linda
Thank
Hunter.
you.
Um, thanks so much for sharing this perspective. Um,
Thank you,
Mike
Linda.
had a question. What are the best news sites for the Middle East perspective?
Oh, this is a wonderful question from Mike. So one that I like to recommend is All Monitor. So that's Monitor, All Monitor. All Monitor has really good analysis and coverage in English, so that's nice, right? That it's accessible then to people that are based in the Anglosphere, in the English-speaking world, to get analysis directly from the ground and from people reporting and doing the analyzing in the Middle East context. Often people, analyzing from the Arab perspective. Another one is Jadalia. That's Jadiliyya, Jadalia. And if you misspell it, I think Google will probably correct you, or whatever search engine will probably suggest for you. But Jadalia is another one. It's taking like a decolonial, more like a resistance approach a lot. You'll really see that in their coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in particular, if you were looking for a perspective that's unfamiliar to what would be like mainstream US coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or different issues impacting, Arab populations in the Middle East, Jadalia will really give you something quite unique in that way. So I'll monitor Jadalia, and then Al Jazeera, which is well known,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of the people that used to work for BBC ended up going over to Al Jazeera, but they just tend to have like a lot more features from the Middle East than you'll get from the US based coverage of world politics, because they will just put it more front and center, and you'll get some really interesting. Al Jazeera has like very interesting short documentaries on things like what's happening with the environment in Iraq, or what's happening with the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. That's like maybe a 20-minute kind of documentary that's free to watch. So Al Jazeera does some things like that, which are very engaging.
Before they discontinued the cable news network, I used to watch that all the time because, it just gave you such a different perspective that you're not getting from anything in like in the U.S., and
Yeah.
sadly it went away. But Dina has a question for you. Um, Working to understand the situation from cultural perspectives is a good goal. How can we expect this will even be possible to achieve or have an impact given the climate of distrust and xenophobia?
Oh, that's such a great question from Dina. I struggle with that every day, Dina. You know, as part of what I do, because have to believe that education matters, and I have to believe that whatever someone's perspective is, just hearing other perspectives and building some kind of knowledge they didn't already have will open more doors and open more light. But it's true that right now, distrust and xenophobia and ethnocentrism is really used as a political tool because it resonates with people to feel like they're under threat and then to feel like they need some politician or whoever is the head of that movement selling them that package that is going to come in and keep you safe from that other strange figure or culture or group. So the fact that we are seeing more populism than ever, which often populists use that appeal to feeling unsafe and feeling scared of somebody who's different. I would agree with Dina that this is particularly challenging, but then the other side of it is that it's so important right now because that is on the rise. People using fear of the stranger, using fear of what you don't know to mobilize you to, vote for them or give funds to something or whatever it is. Follow them on social media. I'm not sure, there's so many iterations of it nowadays, but really using fear, right? And so I think that would be, I would have to believe that it's still possible. And everybody who's tuning in tonight is already taking such a step because you're trying to learn something different that you didn't already know. And if you can find something that connects with you and then share it with others, and not try and convince people to change their mind, that would be a really big one of what makes it more practical and more possible in this kind of climate is, it's not necessarily that you're trying to change somebody's end result of what their opinion is, but just, have you ever thought about other perspectives and really what's it like to immerse yourself in other perspectives? Can you withstand the discomfort and bear the discomfort of immersing yourself in a different perspective, like almost a challenge? Even if you don't ever have to change your view, just try it, just try looking at the story from a different lens. And then maybe some people will say, I did learn a couple of things that I hadn't thought of when I forced myself into that uncomfortable position, of trying to see the story if I were in the shoes of who I view as the bad guy or the aggressor or the enemy or just the really strange foreign, perspective I don't understand and maybe don't even want to understand. And so those would be the ideas I have for that. But Dina's correct. It is a real challenge.
Virginia had another comment, and thank you for the fine presentation of a complex topic. And I couldn't agree more. That's what I always look forward to your lectures because you present really thorny, twisty topics in a way that's easily understandable. And I echo Virginia's statement completely. Thank you so much for that. And Dina had this. I appreciate your words of hope. Thank you for your insights. And I would say this also to everyone who's watching. If you like this lecture, and I can't imagine there would be any reason you wouldn't like this lecture, and for the information, tell people about it. Because what's been put into an hour and a half here at no charge, readily accessible on both YouTube and on Facebook, within seconds of the broadcast ending, it will be archived forever. I highly recommend you let people know about this lecture because I thought it was wonderful. I mean, and
Thank you, Tim.
I'm not just saying
you.
it because, I've made you very big on my screen, which isn't your favorite thing, but but it was wonderful. Virginia also said McIntyre on disinformation was just on TV, which I'm not familiar with. Are you familiar with that by any chance?
I'm not, but I will look into it.
Mm-hmm.
I will look that up. I'm always learning new things from the audiences too. Thank you, Virginia.
I think we have to start winding down because they have started to announce that I have to leave the library soon. But at least I don't have to kick everyone out of the library. That's what I like best about when the topics are virtual. So thank you everyone for your questions and comments. Thank you so much, Professor Coen, for a wonderful lecture. I'll actually bring this down to us. And if anyone would like the PowerPoint, please contact me. I probably won't get to it tonight, but starting tomorrow, tkaczynski@manitowoc.org. Please just email me, and I will get that to you. There are more and more thank yous coming in for your lecture, Dr. Coen. And
Yeah.
before we go, I neglected to do this last week because I'm trying not to talk so much before the lectures, but I neglected to thank our sponsors. Professor Coen did it in part for me, so thank you. But also, in addition to the League of Women Voters and Manitowoc Public Library, just wanted to thank the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation and Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship that are instrumental in bringing this to you week after week, year after year. So a huge thank you to our sponsors. Thank you, Professor Coen, for getting the ball rolling on this topic as well. And I, too, am very glad that we're devoting 2 weeks to this, because it could easily be more than 2 weeks. But I think that we decided to focus on this for a pair of lectures. It was definitely a positive thing to do. And given people a lot to think of, I'm very interested to see what Professor Beth Doherty from Beloit College will be bringing to the table next week for Middle East Alignment Part 2. And that one is being offered hybrid format. We're live in the Balkanski room, but if you can't make it to the Balkanski room, jump online like you did tonight, and you can watch it right here on either Facebook or YouTube. So, again, thank you, Professor Coen. Fantastic lecture.
Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome. But as always, it is really wonderful having you here, and I'm glad that we can have you back year after year. So, thank you.
It's an honor, and thank you to everybody who tuned in, because it's not necessarily something you do on a Monday evening. So I still admire everybody who joins the session.
Well, thank you so much. And Professor Coen is right. Thank you for joining us tonight. It isn't everyone's cup of tea for what they think they should be doing on a Monday night, but I think you're better off for having been here. And that's just my opinion, but for once, I don't think my opinion is wrong. So have a great night, everyone, and thank you for joining us. See you next week in the Balkanski or online.